For centuries, history taught us to remember one name when we think about the discovery of America: Christopher Columbus. But more than 500 years before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, another group of explorers had already reached the shores of North America. They were the Vikings. Around the year 1000, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson sailed west across the dangerous North Atlantic. His journey began in Greenland, a harsh and frozen land where Viking settlers had built small communities. Leif and his crew knew that the ocean ahead of them was unpredictable. Strong winds could destroy a ship, freezing temperatures could kill a man within minutes, and beyond the horizon, there was no guarantee that they would ever find land. But the Vikings were experienced sailors. They navigated using the sun, the stars, the winds, and their knowledge of the sea. Then, after days of sailing through the unknown, something appeared on the horizon: land. Leif Erikson and his men had reached a strange new world. The coastline was unlike Greenland. They saw forests, rivers, rocky shores, and landscapes filled with resources that were rare in their homeland. The Vikings called the first region they encountered Helluland, meaning land of the flat stones. They continued south and discovered another region they called Markland, or land of forests. But they did not stop there. They sailed farther. Eventually, they reached a fertile land where wild grapes grew. Leif called it Vinland. For the Vikings, this discovery was extraordinary. There were forests full of timber. There were fish in the rivers and along the coast. The land was rich enough to support a settlement. So Leif and his men built shelters and spent time exploring the region. But they were not alone. The land was already inhabited by indigenous peoples who had lived in North America for thousands of years. The encounters between the Norse explorers and the local inhabitants were not always peaceful. Tensions grew. Violence eventually erupted. The Vikings realized that remaining in this distant land would be extremely difficult. They had traveled thousands of kilometers from Greenland, across one of the most dangerous oceans on Earth. Supplies were limited. The journey home was long, and the conflicts with the local population made permanent settlement even harder. Eventually, the Vikings abandoned their settlement and returned to Greenland. For centuries afterward, their journey remained largely forgotten outside the Norse sagas. Then, hundreds of years later, another European expedition crossed the Atlantic. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean, opening a new chapter in European history. Columbus became famous as the explorer who discovered the New World for Europe. But the story was more complicated. The Vikings had already crossed the Atlantic and reached North America centuries earlier. And in the 20th century, archaeologists found remarkable evidence of their presence. At Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland in Canada, researchers discovered the remains of a Norse settlement. The site contained evidence of Viking-style buildings, ironworking, and other artifacts that could not be explained as anything other than Norse activity. Scientific dating placed the settlement around the year 1000. The discovery changed our understanding of the history of the Atlantic. It proved that Viking sailors had crossed the ocean and reached North America long before Columbus. But there is an important lesson hidden in this story. The Vikings did not discover an empty continent. North America was already home to indigenous peoples with their own cultures, languages, traditions, and histories. The Vikings were simply among the earliest Europeans known to have reached the continent. Their journey was a remarkable achievement of exploration. With wooden ships, limited navigation tools, and no modern maps, they crossed an enormous ocean into a world they knew almost nothing about. They followed the wind into the unknown, and for a brief moment, nearly 500 years before Columbus, Viking sailors stood on the shores of North America. Their story reminds us that history is rarely as simple as we are taught. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are not made when a famous name appears in a history book. Sometimes they happen centuries earlier, when ordinary people brave an extraordinary journey into the unknown. The Vikings sailed west. They found a new world. And for a moment, they became the first known Europeans to reach North America, long before Columbus.